1 o'clock. Good afternoon. Helen Zaremus with ABC News. The party is continuing to attack the Chinese government despite releasing a statement saying his comments were not directed at Beijing. Anna Henderson reports from Parliament House.
The PUP leader referred to China and communists who shoot their own people in an interview on Monday. The Prime Minister has attacked Clive Palmer's judgment.
Over the top, shrill and wrong.
The Chinese embassy has described the comments as full of prejudice, and a state-owned newspaper has recommended he face sanctions. Today, Clive Palmer defended his stance.
There's no doubt that the Chinese government shoots thousands of people every year.
He's now issued a statement saying his remarks were not directed at the Chinese government or Chinese people. He says the target was the Chinese state-owned company he's battling in the courts. Anna Henderson, ABC News, Canberra.
Okay, well, that was a little bit that they're going to have in the news. Later on, they will have more, and later on, we'll cross to what they have to say. The essence of the story is, for my overseas viewers who may not be paying too much attention to the minutiae of Australian politics, is that Clive Palmer is a businessman. He fancies himself as a bush lawyer, and he has a history, in fact, of being a press secretary to Joh Bjelke-Petersen back in the days of the Joh for PM campaign. On 3 occasions, Clive Palmer has taken somebody to court. One case it was a bank, one case it was the New South Wales government. I am personally unaware who the third party was. But on each occasion, he sued him for $500 million or $550 million. And on each of the 3 occasions, he was paid on the courthouse steps, and no court case ever actually went before the bench. So somebody would perhaps be fair and honest in describing him as a successful litigious crank or a successful predatory litigator. On the other hand, maybe he had a valid case, and maybe he would have won, and maybe he would have got his $500 million each time he was given some fraction of that, generally between 10 and 25%, to go away. Anyway, he's famous for claiming that he's going to resurrect the dinosaur and rebuild the Titanic. He's a self-described billionaire, and he calls himself a professor, although he doesn't appear as a billionaire in Australia's rich list. And Bond University keeps explaining to him that an honorary PhD does not mean that you can call yourself Professor Clive. But anyway, he was deeply enamoured of the Queensland National Party, and he gave them lots of money in donations. And then he told them that he wanted them to enact a bill that he had drafted, basically making him king of the Galilee Basin. And when they said, no, we can't do that, that would be, like too much of an obvious case of crony capitalism, and it's too hot even for the Queensland National Party. Okay, fine. That's when he decided to start the Palmer United Party, which is described as the PUP, P-U-P, Palmer United Party. Now, the fact that this means he's trying to sell the Australian electorate a pup, and selling somebody a pup is old colonial vernacular in Australia for getting somebody to pay to take on an obligation which is going to cost them a lot of money. So Clive Palmer's political party is called the PUP, and the PUP fielded senators or Senate candidates in the recent Australian federal election in September of 2013. But Clive himself, he didn't stand in the Senate. He stood in the House of Representatives, and he's the member for Fairfax. He's a member of Parliament. They've got a very unusual situation in which you've got a big businessman who wants to export coal and iron ore, and who's got mining leases and exploration leases on lots of Australia. And if somebody would build the transport link, and if somebody would build the wharves and the infrastructure to allow the coal and the iron ore to be exported, then he would be a rich man and he would have all these millions that he sometimes describes himself as having. But that's not kind of really what's been going on. I don't think he's shifted any coal out of the Galilee Basin yet. And in Western Australia, he's got a mining permit on a lump of magnetite. Magnetite's really, really tough, heavy-duty iron ore that costs at least $120 a tonne to process. Dig it out of the ground and process. And at the moment, there's much softer kind of iron ore called hematite. And hematite you can buy for about $90 a tonne, which is a lot cheaper than magnetite. And hematite's easier to work with. So Clive convinced a Chinese government-owned steel mill to invest something in the order of $20 or $200 million. I'm not an authority on how much it actually cost for a magnetite mine and a magnetite processing facility. And I've heard that the building that the ball mill, the cyclone as they call it, to process this hard as the hobs are hell type magnetite, the building that the processing plants is contained within is either a square kilometre of roof area or it's a kilometre long. One of those two figures. It still winds up being a hellaciously big and expensive plant to construct. And I understand it's being operated by Chinese nationals who are working as technicians, and they come out on probably 4, 5, 7 visas. And they don't work under Australian conditions because they're Chinese nationals working for a Chinese company on its Australian mine and processing plant and shipping facility. So that's the state of the art. But I understand that the Chinese want to pay approximately $60 million for the ore they've dug out of the ground after it's processed and when it gets to China, and they're basing it on the weight of the processed ore, the refined ore, and Clive wants them to pay $200 million based on the weight of what they dig out of the ground. I think that's what the argument's over. So that's where he gets his theory that the Chinese have taken $200 million worth of ore out of Australia without paying for it. And that's one of the things that he said on TV on Monday night on ABC's Q&A program, stands for question and answer, when he more or less had his ego explode out through his nose and send tongues of fire out his ears. And he said that the Chinese were a mob of mongrels and bastards. He didn't say it was the Chinese businessmen that he was having trouble with. He said the Chinese. He said they were a mob of mongrels and bastards because they wanted to take over Australia. They wanted to take our resources without paying for them. He said they wanted Australian workers to live under Chinese wage conditions. He said they have no justice system, they shoot their own people, and they're a lot of horrible communists. Well, that went over remarkably badly in the national and international media. And then, rushing to Clive's defence, was the PUP ette. Well, we've heard of the PUP, the Palmer United Party, the Senate candidates that he fielded. Well, 3 of them actually got elected. That's the PUP ettes. The PUP ette is the female puppet, and that's a lady from Tasmania called Jackie Lamby. Baaa! And Jackie Lamby, baaa! She seems to have a really strange control freaks, overcompensated inferiority complex, paranoid view of the world, whereby she said that Australia has to prepare to protect itself against becoming slaves of the Chinese when they mount a communist invasion, and we need to have missiles for defence. And when she was asked, how that meshed with Clive Palmer saying a couple of years ago that it would be stupid to go to the Australian Parliament House to listen to Barack Obama announce the pivot to Asia, because Barack Obama was just being racist and imperialist and indulging in neo-colonialism because the Chinese were just wonderful a couple of years ago when Clive was trying to get them to buy into his $200 million useless magnetite mine. Now they're wicked, evil, nasty people because they don't want to pay him all the money that he'd like to think that they said they were going to pay him. And now he's trying to backpedal as fast as he can and say that, oh, well, you know, he's been misquoted and there's a press campaign against him. And how dare anybody hold him to something that he said a couple of years ago when, you know, today's a different day and he should be just magically forgiven, given a free hit, allowed to put his feet in his mouth on Australia's behalf, because that's the point. He's a member of Parliament and he controls 3 senators. It was going to be 4 when the Motoring Enthusiasts Party was for a while rumoured to be in Clive's pocket, but they've had a bit of a disagreement. So he controls 3 senators. And at the moment, the way things have been going, with the Labor Party and the Liberal Party contesting to try and pass the budget in the Senate, the Liberal Party and the National Party want to pass it, the Labor Party doesn't want to pass it. The Greens don't want to pass a whole lot of the issues, and it's up to the crossbenchers. And Clive Palmer's puppets represent the largest single block in among all the other independent fruitcakes, shall we say, or senators. So if Clive Palmer were to instruct the puppets, and if the puppets were to say how high as they jump off the ground, then Clive Palmer could pass the Abbott, Hockey, Truss, Cormann, Sinodinos horror budget if he chooses to, because he sort of has that power, you know, at his command. And he's just revealed himself as a complete egomaniac. A self-oriented, self-motivated, self-obsessed, self-centered, self-made. Wouldn't it be nice if he was a billionaire and a professor? In actual fact, Clive Palmer is just Clive Palmer. And of course, Eric and Fruit Loop seem to be on the point of conceiving another swamp wallaby. Meanwhile, there's a joey in the pouch already, which is probably going to get kicked out and told to go for a walk, if Eric gets his way. So I could keep rolling the camera and keep talking, or I could keep rolling the camera and shut up, or I could just pause the camera. And while the joey's in the pouch, I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of action, and I don't want the movie to be too long. So I am going to take the decision to pause the camera at this point of proceedings, and if the action gets all hot and sweaty out there on the lawn, well, I'll start to film that for you just out of curiosity. And failing that, when the world today examines the phenomenon of Clive Palmer and the puppets and Jackie Lamby Baaa, wanting to have missiles to defend ourselves from a Chinese communist invasion to make us all slaves, I'll record that. So, wait 5.
Palmer United Party has again tried to explain his strident remarks about the Chinese government. Clive Palmer caused a political storm by saying on the ABC's Q&A program that the Chinese government is made up of bastards and mongrels who shoot their own people. His Senate colleague Jackie Lamby added to the outrage by saying there is a threat of a communist invasion. The Chinese embassy in Australia issued a stern rebuke, and a Chinese tabloid newspaper is now calling for sanctions against Clive Palmer. But Mr. Palmer claims he may have been misunderstood and says he's the focus of a political attack. From Canberra, James Glenday reports.
It was these comments from Clive Palmer that caused the initial uproar.
We've had 3 judgments in the Federal Court and the Supreme Court of Western Australia and an arbitration against these Chinese mongrels. I'm saying that's because they're communists, because they shoot their own people, they haven't got a justice system, and they want to take over this country.
And these comments from Senate colleague Jackie Lamby that poured fuel on the fire.
We can't ignore the threat of communist Chinese invasion, and the communist Chinese military is at a record size and capacity.
They've both been roundly condemned, and some business and industry groups have warned of diplomatic and economic fallout. The Prime Minister Tony Abbott says the comments were shrill and wrong.
It seemed to be more an expression of a personal business issue than of a considered national policy.
He thinks the Chinese will understand the context.
I think the Chinese appreciate Australia enough to understand that Mr. Palmer just speaks for himself on an issue like this, and he certainly isn't speaking for Australia.
A Chinese tabloid newspaper is furious. It says authorities should consider banning Clive Palmer from the country and look at sanctions against his businesses. In an editorial, the state-owned Global Times states, China must let those prancing provocateurs know how much of a price they pay when they deliberately rile us. The newspaper is known for its nationalism, and its comments are even sometimes controversial at home. Recently, it called Foreign Minister Julie Bishop a complete fool.
Well, my comments weren't related about the Chinese people. They may have been misunderstood. I mean, we've got to hail the Chinese people for all their achievements, what they've done.
Mr. Palmer appeared on a couple of radio programs this morning to explain himself. On Fairfax Radio in Brisbane, he again insisted his comments only referred to a Chinese state-owned company he's in a bitter legal dispute with, and not the Chinese people.
But we do have to recognise that they do live under a totalitarian regime.
And claimed he and his senators are being attacked for political reasons.
Well, I think there's been an overall campaign in Australia against us and our 3 senators. You've got to remember, the Senate's made up of about 70 senators, but all you ever hear about is me or Jackie Lamby or somebody, because the powers that be are upset that they haven't got control of the Senate, and we've got the balance of power. That the Conservative side of politics is very ruthless and will do anything they can to discredit people and to attack, and that's what it's about.
But when repeatedly asked on ABC Radio in Perth if he supported the comments by his colleague Jackie Lamby, he became annoyed and employed a tactic he's used before.
And what do you make of your own senator's comments, Jackie Lamby's comments, that we should prepare ourselves for the possibility of a Chinese invasion, and we need to make sure that our grandchildren are not turned into slaves?
Well, I'd refer you back to Julie Bishop's comments.
No, I'd like you to comment. I'd like you to comment on your own senator's remarks,
well,
please.
You might like to do that, but I'll do what I want to.
Well, how about you being accountable, sir? How about you being accountable? How about you being accountable for comments made by your senator?
I'm accountable to my comments as a citizen of this country, and she's a citizen of Australia too. If she wants to make a comment, that's fine.
Do you support her comments?
I'm talking about the Foreign Minister of this country.
Well, I'm talking about Jackie Lamby.
Well, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the Foreign Minister of this country, because I don't have to. Goodbye.
And that's the leader of the Palmer United Party, Clive Palmer, ending that report by James Glenday.
Well, there you go. They gave you the grab of what he said on Q&A. They're a bunch of mongrels and bastards, and they're communists, and they shoot their own people, and they have no justice system, and they want to come out here and take all our resources. And Jackie Lamby, Baaa, who Clive Palmer paid for all the election campaigning and public relations material that got her to be a senator for the puppets, she says that China's military is at record levels, and we should orient our entire defensive policy towards staving off a communist invasion, otherwise our children will become slaves. And meanwhile, the Chinese communist government steel mill, or communist government-owned steel mill, has still got the shits at Clive for spending about half the money they gave him to administer their Magnatite iron ore mine processing plant and export facility, and he spent their money on his public relations campaign to get elected. And when the Chinese government-owned steel mill made those comments in paper, he took them to court for defamation of character for $660 million. How dare they say that about him? I think he's writing whole new definitions for the word corporate psychopath and megalomaniac. But like I said, he's all that stands between Australia and Joe Hockey's horror budget. Baubles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.